The well-being of mankind, its peace and security, are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. This unity can never be achieved so long as the counsels which the pen of the Most High hath revealed are suffered to pass unheeded. Baha'u'llah. In every dispensation, the light of divine guidance has been focused upon one central theme. In this wondrous revelation, this glorious century, the foundation of the faith of God and the distinguishing feature of His law is the consciousness of the oneness of mankind. Abdul Baha.
So this week, we're so happy to have Dr. Augusto Lopez-Claros, and his topic is A New Vision of World Order, Renewing the United Nations Charter. Dr. Lopez-Claros is currently the chair of the Global Governance Forum, an organization committed to fostering strengthened international cooperation in the search for solutions to global problems. He's an economist with over 30 years of experience in international organizations. He's worked in a number of senior roles at the World Bank, where he was director of the Global Indicators Group, at the World Economic Forum, where he was chief economist, and the International Monetary Fund, which he represented in Moscow during the 1990s. He's published extensively on a range of economic development topics and issues of international cooperation, and has also lectured at some of the world's leading universities, think tank, and international organizations. His latest books are Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All, and Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century. So with that, I'm happy to hand it off to Dr. Lopez-Claros.
Thank you very much, Paimane. It's a pleasure to be with you and with your guests. And this is a subject actually which has been of great interest to me in recent years. And I think partly because not only the current sort of economic and political situation in the world, and this sense of great concern that you find in many places about the direction that the world is headed, and the many sort of unmet challenges that we have, but I guess also because in the Baha'i faith, which is a sort of a world global religion, in addition to the usual concerns about the life of the spirit and issues of spiritual development and the development of our inner selves, there is also a vision of sort of global order, which is very much part of the Baha'i writings. In particular, the writings of Shoghi Effendi, who was the head of the Baha'i community between 1921 and 1957, provide a kind of a blueprint, a very detailed analysis of what are the kinds of institutions that we need to create in order to facilitate international cooperation and in order to make it feasible for all of us, the human family, to find solutions to the very serious problems which we confront. So what I like to do is I like to begin by perhaps sharing with you, 2 or 3 examples of problems which we're facing today, which not only raise concerns about the near-term future of mankind, but also emphasize very much the idea that in order to address these global challenges and problems, we are going to have to strengthen the mechanisms of cooperation across national borders between states and nations. I'm sure that, like everybody else around you, you have been following over the last few years the kind of evidence that is coming from the scientific community in terms of what is happening with climate. Many decades ago, the United Nations set up a group of scientists called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and very sort of with increasing frequency and vigor, they have been highlighting the concerns of the scientists about the lack of action on climate change and the very catastrophic consequences which are likely to come as a result of the rise in average temperatures. the United Nations Environment Program, which is an organization based in Geneva in Switzerland, last October issued a report in which they said that there is no, I quote, no credible pathway to 1.5 degrees in place. This reference to 1.5 degrees is the threshold which scientists regard as permissible within the existing sort of Earth system. If temperatures rise above 1.5 degrees with respect to the pre-industrial period, there is a great deal of concern that we will be facing, the catastrophic impacts of climate change. And then in that report of last October, the scientists which put together this report urge, the rapid transformation of societies, right? I leave it to you to decide whether that is something that is likely to happen or not, but the challenge is there. So on the climate change side, we face, a fairly complicated near-term future. Over the last several decades, physicists and specialists who follow issues of disarmament and nuclear weapons, they have been greatly concerned about what they call the unraveling of our nuclear order, the kinds of treaties that had been in place for many decades, placing limits on nuclear weapons and the military, which had been negotiated in previous decades between some of the major military powers. Many of them have been abandoned. They have been set aside, and we're gradually entering a very chaotic world in which there are no controls, there are no monitoring mechanisms. It's a kind of a free-for-all, and this of course poses great danger for our global security. There is a treaty called the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, which was is perhaps the last outstanding treaty and the most comprehensive in terms of country coverage. I think something like 180 plus countries have signed it. And if you actually read that treaty, there is an Article 6, which in which the signatories of the treaty, which is basically all the countries in the world, they undertake to pursue negotiations in good faith for the effective cessation of the nuclear arms race, all of this leading to nuclear disarmament. But in fact, if you actually look at the reality on the ground, there have been no steps taken for nuclear disarmament. In fact, quite the opposite. The very countries that have signed this treaty, the nuclear powers among them, are building up their nuclear arsenals, modernizing their arsenals. In 2021, in the middle of COVID, when there were so many needs across the world because of the pandemic, these nuclear powers spent $82 billion, modernizing their nuclear weapons. And so this is a great source of concern. And then one last issue that perhaps I can mention in passing is what's happening on the poverty and inequality side. The World Bank issued a report last year saying that in 2022, we had seen the largest increase in global inequality since the end of World War II. And this is a great concern because there is a lot of evidence that suggests that when inequality increases, political instability, goes up as well. And this actually reminds me of a number of talks which were given by Abdul Baha, the head of the Baha'i community between 1892 and 1921. He was traveling in America in 1912. And for some reason, perhaps because he perceived the great inequity in American society, he emphasized very much the importance of narrowing what he called extremes of wealth and poverty. And this became sort of like a very important principle of Baha'i thinking, at least as explained by him. And one of the points that he made was that he said, if these income disparities, this great gap between the very wealthy and the very poor is not addressed by governments, that this would lead to an unraveling of social and political stability, that inequality was not just an issue of fairness, an issue of opportunity and giving people a chance, to grow out of poverty and make a contribution to our economy, our society, but that also it ultimately was very much linked to, the stability of societies. And I thought that warning of his, which he gave in 1912, is very much present today. There are parts of the world where there is a great deal of inequality and which are becoming, ungovernable. And this is leading to chaos, to confusion, to instability. For that reason, I think that Abdu'l-Baha may have felt the need, more than 100 years ago, to issue a warning that this problem needed to be addressed in a proactive way. And in fact, he had a number of proposals and ideas as to how to address the problem of inequality. This talk is not about that, so I won't go into those details, but it's there. There is a very interesting set of proposals which he put on the table, which interestingly, 100 years later, are very much part of the debate which is taking place in the academic community, in the international organizations like the World Bank, where I worked for many years, about what to do about inequality. And there is a very direct linkage to some of the ideas put forward by Abdu'l-Baha back then when he was traveling in America. Okay? So the reason I wanted to start my short presentation with these ideas, with these examples, is basically to highlight that more and more you see experts, leading academics, country representatives at the United Nations General Assembly and other policymaking circles, people increasingly concerned, with this very, very uncertain outlook for our near-term future, and this sense that we're not addressing these global problems, that they're festering there. We have recognized the existence of these problems, but we're not taking the decisions collectively that need to be taken in order to address them meaningfully. And this is causing or creating a very dangerous situation for humanity. And so you hear more and more talk of people faced with this impending dangers, these global catastrophic risks, as sometimes they're called, essentially asking themselves whether perhaps we should not be rethinking our global order, whether we should not be thinking what are the kinds of institutions and mechanisms which we need to develop in order to move to a more peaceful, more secure world where conditions are created so that people can focus on developing their capacities, their talents, prospering, and evolving as a human family in a way that is essentially peaceful and cooperative, right? Now, the last time that there was such kind of thinking, sort of questioning the very foundations of human organization and what we needed to do to create a more secure and safe world, was actually in the 1940s, against the background of World War II. It's really interesting to review the history of that period because, that war was the largest, most lethal, most violent war ever seen in our recorded history. By the end of the war in 1945, something like 60 million people had perished. Entire cities had been destroyed. It was one of the bloodiest conflicts in our history, and therefore, in the early 1940s, there was a sense that we needed to strengthen our global order in some way to prevent that from ever happening again. And so it was against that background the United Nations was created in 1945. Well, actually, it was created in 1942, but in 1945, finally, the 51 nations came together at a conference in San Francisco who adopt the UN Charter, which was like it was an international treaty. You can think of it as a kind of a world constitution. It laid out, very important principles that would regulate the way in which, nations would interact with each other, the way in which they would try to collaborate in trying to resolve conflicts through peaceful means. The United Nations Charter made a commitment to promote the social and economic development of peoples all over the world. And so it was seen as a very important kind of founding document. Again, I emphasize this was 1945. We had just come out of a very bloody conflict. And so there was a kind of a willingness, to think big and to think in an ambitious fashion, to see, whether we could establish a kind of a new institutional framework for peace and security. That story, or history, if you wish, it's really a very fascinating one. And for me, anyway, as a Baha'i, it has been a kind of a very fascinating case study, to examine against the background of the vision of global order, which was presented in the Baha'i writings, and which Shoghi Effendi, in particular, whom I mentioned before, was very, was instrumental in developing and articulating. In 1943, 1944, when the draft of that UN Charter, that founding document, was being discussed, one could not avoid noticing that, at least in the initial stages, the expectation was that we would create something like a global parliament, and would give this organization the ability to do international law that would be binding on its members. In fact, many of the people who participated in those consultations leading to the adoption of the UN Charter, had a vision that was partly inspired by what happened in the United States in 1787 with the adoption of the US Constitution. As you know, at that time, the creation of the United States of America actually involved the bringing into being of a new level of government, the federal government, which would have monopoly on the use of force. It would have jurisdiction over a number of different areas. From then on, once the Constitution was adopted, the states would not be able to do war on each other. They would not be able to issue their own currency. They would not be able to regulate interstate trade, which would become an attribute of the federal government. And many people in time, came to believe that this moment in American history, the creation of the federal government and the bringing together of the states, into a kind of a coherent, unified, political framework, is something that led to the emergence of the United States in future decades as the most important economic and political power, because essentially what happened is that you created a context where the states would no longer have to be at war with each other, and they could focus their energies and their priorities on development, on expansion, on encouraging entrepreneurship, reaching out into other areas of the vast continental United States, for exploration and for development. And I am convinced that this is actually a sound argument. Once you took away from the states the ability to do war with each other, then you created a context for sort of peaceful coexistence and development. It's true, in the 19th century, there was a civil war in the United States linked to the issue of slavery, but that was a temporary setback. It was bloody, it lasted 4 years, but after that, the US got back on this path of economic and social development and prosperity, and by the late 19th century, early 20th century, the United States again was emerging as a global economic and political power, right? So Abdu'l-Baha, when he was traveling in America, he met an American diplomat who very much wanted to, and asked him, what is it that I can do to promote the interests of peace and security in the world? And Abdu'l-Baha told him, if you if you really want to do something that is creative and constructive, that will deliver a safer and more secure world, then you should promote the principles of federalism, which underpin the political organization of your country, but you should do that on a global scale, for the whole world. So that was an interesting insight. There has been a sort of very interesting debate as to whether what was created at the San Francisco Conference in 1945 was ambitious enough, or whether it was in fact a missed opportunity. And let me explain what I mean by that. In 1945, what came out of the San Francisco Conference and the UN Charter that we still have today, which hasn't been amended very much, was a kind of a compromise. The organization that was ultimately created in 1945 was not a global legislature, with the ability to do international law binding on its member countries. It was a hybrid. We had a General Assembly, which had country representatives, and then we had a Security Council, where the real political power was concentrated, and in which a handful of countries, enjoyed what is called the veto power, which is essentially the ability to exempt themselves from the principles of the UN Charter by the lawful use of the veto. And so there were already warnings at that time from people like Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, Grenville Clark, other prominent personalities who were saying, you have created a deliberately weak organization, which is not going to be very effective in ensuring peace and security. And their forecasts, their views, have turned out to be very prescient. This is, in fact, what has happened. The United Nations, although through some of its specialized agencies, like the World Health Organization, have done a lot of good in the world. And we must give them credit for that. On issues of peace and security in particular, they have been far less successful, because the existence of concentrating all the political power within the Security Council and then giving the veto power to a handful of countries, has paralyzed the United Nations in many ways. When the UN was created, the idea was actually to embed within the UN Charter the concept of collective security. This is something that had actually been laid out in the Baha'i writings in the 19th century. The founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, actually enunciated the principle of collective security in one of his tablets, as they are called, one of his writings, one of the letters that he wrote, in which he explained what the meaning of collective security was. He basically said that in a world that is growing more and more interdependent, if the head of a member state would rise up in arms and attack a neighboring country or claim territory that was not its own, that it was the responsibility of the entire international community to rise up against that tyrant and to stop him from breaking international law and imposing his authority in a violent and arbitrary way. So it's called collective security in the sense that it becomes a responsibility that is shared by everybody, to redress instances of injustice. So that principle was already laid out in the Baha'i writings in the 19th century. Well, when the UN Charter was adopted in 1945, that principle also was embedded in one of the articles of the UN Charter, Article 26, where there's an explicit call for the member countries, to make military resources available to the United Nations, so that the United Nations can rise up as a united entity, to redress abuses, to redress genocide, to redress instances in which member countries do something that is violent, that is destructive, and that goes against the principles of the UN. But that article was never operationalized. The United Nations was never given what was necessary, and the instrumentality, an international peace force that could actually do the bidding of the international community and redress instances of genocide, injustice, and so on. We're actually living today an example of the failure of the implementation of that article in what is happening in Ukraine. Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council and the United Nations, one of its founding members, basically is involved in an unprovoked attack of aggression against a neighbor, Ukraine. It is in violation of all the principles of the United Nations Charter, and yet it remains a member in good standing of that organization because of the power of the veto, right? And so, since we don't have an international peace force attached to the UN, there is nothing that we can do to reverse that aggression. So the international community has had to act outside of the United Nations system. NATO in particular and its members, are providing support to Ukraine so that they can defend themselves against Russian aggression. Right? That is not the idea that was embedded in the UN Charter. The idea was that the United Nations itself would have the instruments, to redress instances of aggression and injustice and attack and violation of the principles of the UN Charter. Now, let me come to the heart of what I want to say. I'm looking at my watch, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions and answers. When the delegates representing these 51 countries met in San Francisco in 1945 to adopt the UN Charter, that was a conference that lasted several months, actually. There were very delicate deliberations. And there were several countries, 17 of them actually, led by New Zealand, whose prime minister was there at that conference, who were very perturbed by the introduction of the veto power in the Security Council. And they were saying, if you do this, it will make the organization very ineffective. In fact, it will never be able to solve problems between major powers and their allies because the big powers will always come and veto decisions made, to address injustices or to try to redress, aggression and war. And so, to placate these 17 countries who basically were threatening not to join the United Nations, who were very upset at this principle, that would exempt the permanent members from the principles of the Charter through the use of the veto, they introduced an article in the UN Charter, famous Article 109, which essentially says that, within 10 years of the adoption of the Charter, there could be a general conference where we would open up the whole issue of the appropriateness of the UN Charter and whether the UN Charter needed to be amended, reflecting the changes that had taken place in the world. This is really a very interesting principle because it is completely aligned with something that Shoghi Effendi, the head of the Baha'i community, had said many years before, actually in 1931. This was 1931, it's the worst of the economic depression, not just in the United States, but in Europe. What started out as the collapse of the stock market in 1929 in New York, little by little mutated into a kind of a global, economic crisis that affected countries as far away as Australia. And so against that background, Shoghi Effendi said, the problem today, the reason why people feel so perturbed and worried about the future is due to our failure to adjust our economic and political institutions to the needs of a rapidly changing world. So he established this principle, that institutions, if they're to be effective in addressing the problems that we face, they too need to be flexible. They need to be adaptable. The world is in a process of constant change and transformation, and these institutions need to be living instruments. They need to evolve in a way that reflects the needs of society as society evolves and changes. In a way, this was an application of a more fundamental principle in the Baha'i writings, which it says that religion itself, the great world religions, have come at different times in history, with solutions to the problems that are a reflection of the circumstances facing societies at the particular moment in which the religion appears. And that as time passes by, as the centuries go by, as societies evolve and fundamental changes take place because of science, because of technology, because of communications, because of geography, and so on, that the religion itself needs to adapt itself, and its teachings need to reflect the needs of society at that time. So Shoghi Effendi, in a way, was drawing a parallel with the evolution of religion as a force for transformation, and saying our institutions as well need to evolve and reflect the needs of society. So this article in the UN Charter was embedding that very interesting principle of an organization that needs to evolve and needs to change in reflection of the needs of the broader world. And so this article basically said, within 10 years, we will hold a review conference and rethink the appropriateness of the charter. Unfortunately, by 1955, we were in the middle of the Cold War. The major powers, the US, the Soviets, they had no interest in opening up the debate about the UN Charter and whether it was still appropriate and whether one could do away, for instance, with the veto. And so what has happened, in fact, is that over the last 78 years, the UN Charter has not been amended. That conference has never taken place. The Charter is very much the same charter that we had in 1945, except for a couple of very minor cosmetic changes, which is not even worth mentioning. I won't bore you with the details because they don't change the sense and the underlying principles of the charter. So let me come to the present, just to conclude. In 2020, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Charter. And as you can imagine, there was a great deal of soul searching in the world. There was a kind of questioning, is the UN still effective? Can we trust the United Nations to become a vehicle for effective international cooperation that will allow us to find solutions to the problems of climate change, inequality, the unraveling of our nuclear order, and other issues of long-term security. And also this coincided with a sense, which I think is becoming more and more ingrained in the world at large, among young people, in the business community, including many governments, who feel that our system, our world order, the sets of institutions and principles which regulate international cooperation on a global scale, to address, global challenges, is not working. It is certainly not. It's broken down. It's not an exaggeration to say. It's broken down because it's not delivering solutions. In 2015, 190 countries came together in Paris to sign the Paris Agreement on climate change, and emissions have continued to rise, since 2015. And as I said at the beginning of my presentation, scientists are basically saying there is no viable path to maintain temperatures below this critical threshold of 1.5 degrees. And so more and more people are saying, now what is going to happen is that we're just going to have to deal with the catastrophic consequences of climate change. So the system is not delivering solutions. And so more and more people are beginning to say, we need to rethink our global order. And in particular, more and more people are saying, why don't we go back to Article 109 in the United Nations Charter and call for a review conference of the Charter so that we can establish a kind of a new charter for the 21st century, so that we can imbue our mechanisms of international cooperation with the effectiveness and the principles systems and give it the instruments that are necessary in order to create a global order that will actually allow us, to bypass the kinds of calamities that are coming our way and perhaps find a more peaceful way of addressing these challenges. Let me finish by sharing with you. This is a little unusual. I'm going to quote myself. I was in Stockholm a year ago. Actually, nearly exactly a year ago. It was the sort of late June, early July. It was the 50th anniversary of the first global environmental conference. In 1972 in Stockholm, we had the first UN conference on the environment. Most people think that the first conference happened in Rio in 1992, but that's not correct. There were 20 years before there was one in Stockholm. And so last year, there was a conference in Stockholm called Stockholm Plus 50. In other words, 50 years after the 72 conference, countries, representatives from civil society, scientists, and others, something like 3,000 people came together, to discuss, the progress made or most likely not made, and where we are on this question of the environment. And I had a chance to speak in one of the events, many events that were held during those days in Stockholm. And I just want to finish with a couple of sentences that I said at the end of my remarks, because I think they capture a little bit what the challenge is that we currently face today. I said the following. I said, the key question before the nations and leaders of the world is whether the needed actions are taken as a matter of conscious choice and prevention, or whether it will be prompted by the destruction and suffering brought by escalating environmental breakdown and other such global catastrophic risks. My hope is that we will take the constructive path of deliberation and consultation, the path that respects human life and aims to create a better future for our children. And I continue to believe that those words are still relevant 1 year later. That is, in fact, the choice that we face. If we continue to dither, if we continue to basically refuse to cooperate in a meaningful way internationally to address problems like climate change, then these problems are not going away. We are going to just see, increasing evidences of instability and calamity and shocks to the Earth system, to the climate, to the economy, to finance, to human health, because all of these are parts of a very complex system that is, fully integrated, in which every component part affects other parts, and that particular future is a little bit perturbing. It's one that brings with it a great deal of suffering, and that is not a future that I want. And I think that all of us, the people in this conversation, your friends, your colleagues, your children, your relatives, your neighbors, others, have a vested interest in fact, taking the path of deliberation, the path of consultation, the path where we work with our politicians, with the business community, with other groups in society, to make the reforms and make the changes that are necessary in order for us to avoid those calamities and to have a more peaceful and secure world. I will stop here, and I understand from Peymane that it is your practice to have Q&A. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you. Back to you, Peymane.
Thank you so much for your talk. This is really interesting. So can the UN not expel Russia over its violation of their own charters and agreements? Surely it's proof that the superpowers have a built-in opt-out clause, which means that there was never going to be any conformity with these rules and regulations.
Yeah, that it's a good question. Thank you. There was a member of the US delegation at the San Francisco conference. His name was Cord Meyer. He was a young man. He was in his late 20s. He was a veteran. He had been wounded in the war in Europe. he had lost an eye, and because he was a brilliant young man, he came back and joined the government, and he was actually a part of the U.S. delegation at the San Francisco conference. And because he had seen the war up close, and he had a very gifted pen, soon after, while still in his late 20s, he wrote this impressive article in The Atlantic, this very famous magazine, which is still publishing today. It's one of my favorite magazines, actually. And in that article, it was a critique of the system that had been created in San Francisco, and in particular the UN Charter. And there was one part in the article where he says, a major power can violate every principle and purpose set forth in the Charter and yet remain a member of the organization by the lawful use of the veto power expressly granted to it. And unfortunately, from a purely legal perspective, and Paimane, you are a lawyer, so you will understand this, that there is nothing that can be done, to actually punish Russia for its aggression within the UN system, because they simply, when the Security Council wanted to do something as mild as issue a resolution condemning the aggression, the invasion, and asking Russia to leave, to go back to the pre-February 24 borders, the Russians said no, and that vote, within the legal framework of the UN Charter is actually a legal one, right? And that's why at that moment the General Assembly took over, and they drafted a resolution that was even tougher in content, and they 141 countries voted for the resolution, asking Russia to leave and condemning the resolution, right? But unfortunately, the United Nations doesn't have the instruments that are necessary to actually carry out its resolutions. In other words, it becomes like a declaration. It's a terrible thing you have done. You should leave the country, and that's it. It ends there, right? And the Russians can ignore it, and the UN itself cannot do anything about it, which comes back to the whole question of, should the UN have the instrumentality, a peace force, an army that operates to reflect the will of the international community and that act in a way that reverses invasions, reverses genocide, reverses instances of aggression. So that is a flaw of the system, and unfortunately, short of amending the Charter or short of creating an international peace force, that would have the instruments, the means, to reverse these invasions, there is nothing much that we can do other than go outside of the UN system, which is what is happening today. So NATO has taken over. NATO is providing the weapons and the support to the Ukrainians to defend themselves against Russia, right? But it's not the UN. It's not the UN. So if this conflict takes place in Asia, in Latin America, which is outside of the NATO environment, then there is nothing we can do. There's absolutely nothing, And that has been the case in places like Syria, Sudan, and many other parts of the world, where NATO could not intervene because it was not in its particular area of influence. And so what you have seen is massive calamity, massive death, suffering for hundreds of thousands of people.
Did Abdu'l-Baha's tablet to The Hague have any effect on finding and also development of the UN charters?
The Tablet of The Hague is a very, very important document, and it was a contribution that Abdu'l-Baha made to the debate about the kind of security arrangements that were necessary to prevent World War I from happening again. Right? Abdu'l-Baha was writing to some eminent public figures, thinkers, journalists, writers who had come together in what we would call a civil society organization based in The Hague, and he wrote to them in 1919 and basically said, I fully support what you're trying to do, which is to rethink how to establish a kind of new institutions that will allow us to address the problem of war and violence. It's a very, very sort of fascinating document because it lays out principles. He says that, for instance, peace is not just about, arms control and weapons. That if you want to have a lasting peace, you need to address other important issues of poverty, of opportunity. You need to rethink the role of religion. Religion should be a force for dialogue and for understanding, not a force for division. He talks about the use of science and technology. He actually refers to the malignant uses of science and technology, for developing weapons whose only purpose is to destroy humankind rather than using science and technology for the betterment of mankind and so on. So it's a very powerful document. I think that many of those ideas, this sense of, we need to build up institutions to provide a framework for collaboration and for consultation between nations, which were very much part of the Tablet of the Hague, did find their way into the UN Charter. But I'm not sure that there is a kind of a direct linkage to the Tablet of the Hague itself. It may have been that was the prevailing view at that time, that faced with World War I and later on with World War II, there was a very powerful sense that we needed to be creative, we needed to be innovative in the way we thought about how we are going to strengthen international cooperation. Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of England at that time, he said, it's a very interesting thought. He said that in the middle of this crisis, we must never be accused of lacking the imagination, to rethink our systems of cooperation. Right? So he was aware, this is a particularly dire moment in history. We need to rise to the occasion. We need to think big, because only thinking big and doing big things are we going to prevent, this calamity from happening again, i.e. World War III. So Abdul Baha was very much part of that conversation, and when you read the Tablet of the Hague, you cannot but have deep admiration for his insights and for his understanding of the human situation and what needed to be done to create a kind of a solid basis for peace and security in the future.
Thank you. The next question is, today's news is reporting that the Wagner Group, an aggressive private mercenary army working for Russia in the Ukraine, is challenging Putin's rule. If they gain control, this would be catastrophic, as nuclear arms would be in their hands. What are some of the measures that the UN has to curtail this dangerous situation?
Yeah, it's a difficult situation. As you know, this war has been a great blunder for the Russian government. First of all, it was unprovoked. Ukraine posed no security threat to Russia, but the invasion was predicated on mistaken assumptions about the strength of the Russian military. Again, there's no need for me to recount what you have read in the press over the last year. It's an adventure that has not gone well at all for the Russian government. In fact, quite the opposite. As I think, what are the benefits for Russia as a nation of having invaded Ukraine? And I can't think of a single one. I can think of a single. All I can think of is cost. It has essentially pulverized their economy. It has isolated the country from the global financial system. It has led to the massive departure of hundreds of thousands, if not by now, well over 1 million of the brightest and the most competent of the younger people, who were very active in the IT sector, in science and technology. Those that had the means and could do it have left the country because they don't, especially young men, they don't want to be drafted into a war that has no purpose and in which they're highly likely to die. It has led to a great deal of suffering, not just for the Ukraine, but for the Russian young men who have been drafted and then have died in battles, over the last years. So it's been a calamity and I think that what may be happening today is the beginning of who knows, something like a short civil war, right, where the country turns on itself, where there is a segment of society that can no longer justify this violent war, which is so damaging, not just to Ukraine, but to the country itself, to Russia itself. And then, there is an attempt to basically, force political change so that the war can come to an end. And so that Russia can get back on a path of development, of integration, of not aggression and warfare, but construction and peace and security and prosperity, which is my hope. I spent 4.5 years in Russia representing my organization back in the 1990s. I know the country well. I think I know its history reasonably well. And I have no doubt that the country has the potential, to grow and to prosper as other nations of the world. But you can't do that by violence and warfare and aggression and killing innocent people and so on. No, and that is impossible. And this war has turned Russia into a pariah state. Few countries want to have anything to do with it, and that's a very ungrateful situation to be in. Can the UN do something about this? Not really, not really. The UN can issue declarations, and they have done that, but those are of limited use. They have symbolic value, but they don't really change the reality on the ground. NATO, and through its support of Ukraine, and Ukraine itself, is perhaps the only party that can do something in this area. And as you know, there is an offensive underway. Who knows? Maybe over the next few weeks we will see interesting news coming from those battlefields.
Comment saying when the environmentalists discuss this issue, they rarely mention the terrible consequences of war on the environment.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And we've already seen some of that in Ukraine, correct? I mean, the Russians are supposed to have blown up this dam a few weeks back, which caused huge flooding. All these unexploded weapons, the mines that are being used to mine the fields, to prevent the movement of troops. All these things, have huge consequences. And of course, the death and the dying and the wounded, this has huge implications. War is a tremendously violent and bloody business, and it has huge implications on the psychology and the mental health and the minds of the people who participate in this horrible undertaking. Hollywood has romanticized, war in some ways, but it is a terrible blight on humanity, and Russia and the Ukraine will be suffering the consequences of this massive killing that has taken place over the past year, a little more than a year, for years and years to come. And I'm not just talking about, sort of wounded soldier. My wife and I attended a dinner presentation last night here in Washington, where I was speaking to a large group of former colleagues from the IMF, from the World Bank, and so on. And one of my colleagues was from Ukraine, and she told my wife that her cousin, the son of his father's brother, had lost a leg in the war, right? So he was now an invalid. And you say, well, how terrible, a young man, all of a sudden is handicapped for the rest of his life. But it isn't just that. It's the psychological damage, the mental anguish that often accompanies, or that always accompanies, when we do violence to each other and we participate in this, very, very horrible enterprise called war. And think of the expense associated with the reconstruction of Ukraine. You have seen countless photographs of destroyed buildings, hospitals, child centers, and so on. what is the economic cost of reconstructing that country? How long is it going to take? Who's going to pay for it? I mean, it's just horrible. And yet you would have thought that we would have learned that war ultimately is a self-defeating enterprise. It hardly ever brings any economic or other benefits. But we haven't learned that lesson, and certainly the Russians haven't learned that lesson.
It says, it seems to my humble observation that the member countries of the UN, their leaders, Congress members, and people see this principle that is noted in the messages of the Universal House of Justice, which says, the benefit of the part is in the benefit of the whole, and the benefit of the whole is in the benefit of the part.
Yes, when you actually look at the UN Charter, especially the preamble, the part that begins with the peoples of the world, it has some very, very noble principles. This the notion of human rights is embedded in the UN Charter, the concept of gender equality, the idea of global citizenship, that we are members of one human family, that we're all on this together, that we need to work together to address these global challenges, is there. And so in that sense, I think that the UN Charter was kind of revolutionary in its ability to capture this sense of a global community, right? Unfortunately, there is a gap between the ideals very often and the practice, and especially after the UN Charter was adopted, as I said before, we went into a period of many decades of a Cold War, this ideological battles between East and West, between the communist system and the sort of system embodied by the Western nations. Based on principles of democracy, human rights, and so on, that lasted for decades. And so along the way, we often tended to forget those noble principles of the UN Charter. And so we need to go back and give meaning to those principles. And as Shoghi Effendi said, we need to adapt our institutions and the principles of the instruments that underpin these institutions to reflect the realities of a changing world. That is why we need to review the UN Charter. That is why we need to have a new constitution. For those of you who are members of the Baha'i community in the audience, you may find it interesting that Abdul Baha actually said that that moment would come. He didn't say when, but he said that there would come a moment in the history of our human family when there would be general acceptance for the idea that we needed a new charter for the world. He said that a few high-minded sovereigns would, for the good of the world and for peace and security in the world, come together and negotiate a new charter for the world. And then he said that this charter, this document, which would lay out the principles of international cooperation for the future, would be subject to what I would now interpret to be a kind of a global referendum. It would be made legitimate through a popular consultation where citizens of the member countries that wanted to join this new vision, would have to endorse it, right? And that's a fascinating vision, but he spoke of it in quite a lot of detail. So I think that moment will come. I cannot tell you whether it will be in the next 10 years or in the next 50 years. I don't think anybody can say. We live in a world that is dynamic, where change is taking place at a very rapid pace. But of one thing I'm sure, and that is that we're not addressing these global problems. These global problems are all interconnected, and they have the potential to create great instability in the world. And that itself may be the precipitating factor in bringing our leaders into the negotiating table to draft a new charter, a new constitution, if you wish, for the world that would lay out the basis for a period of immense progress and development, and in a sense, perhaps possibly a kind of a golden age for the human family. But we need to deal with the issue of war first. We need to stop the killing. We need to establish a solid basis for peace and security, and then we can focus our attentions on developing the capacities of the human brain, the human mind. Then we can focus our energies and our capacities on science and technology for the betterment of the conditions of our human family.
Thank you. The next question is, I'm concerned about the people who are in Russia and Ukraine that cannot move out from this situation. What can we do to assist those who are in Ukraine and Russia? There is a Baha'i community in these countries. What can we do to support their work? How can we slow down the prejudice against these countries?
You know that this war has created millions and millions of refugees. The war in Ukraine has been worse than what happened in Syria between 2011 and 2018. It has been worse than what happened during the Balkan Wars between 1991 and 1993-94, just in terms of the humanitarian impact of the war. Especially for Ukraine, you know, that have been the object of the violence and the killing, you know, at the hands of the Russian army. There are Baha'i communities, well-established Baha'i communities in both countries. My own sense is that these societies, I'm thinking of Russia in particular, you know, reform and change has to come from within. It cannot be imposed either by other countries or by the United Nations. You know, nations have to work these problems out themselves. They either through the democratic process or in some other fashion, involving an element of choice, you know, where people get to decide, you know, who they're ruled by and you know, what the future will entail, who they trust to lead them and so on. I think that some of that may already be underway. Literally today, you know, the developments today are very interesting because they suggest that the Russian society is divided, right? That in the middle of a war, you know, for there to emerge a group which challenges the established government, you know, is very interesting. You know, it suggests that maybe a new narrative is emerging about this war that perhaps is questioning the official line, you know, that is basically saying, look, this has been a great mistake. We need to redress it. We need to do something to stop it. And my hope is that process, if it continues, you know, it could well lead, you know, to perhaps, you know, some interesting developments which could precipitate the end of the war. That is to be hoped anyway.
Next question is about the concept you talked about of Baha'u'llah's vision of if there's one nation that's aggressive, all the other nations rise up against them. So how can that principle work at this time?
You know that in the Baha'i faith, we're not pacifists. The Baha'i faith actually admits that in some instances, the use of force may be necessary to redress injustices. Right? And that to me is a fascinating contribution to the thinking about you know, war and peace and security. Right? Baha'u'llah explicitly, in talking about the concept of collective security, says that, you know, all the other nations should rise up and try to put the aggressor government, you know, out, you know, to depose it, so that it, you know, the injustice is reversed, and that can happen only in the context of the use of force, right? But it is the use of force with the ultimate end, right, of supporting justice, that reversing injustices which may have taken place as a result of the aggression, the invasion, the genocide, whatever. For me, for that concept to be meaningful and for it to actually work in practice, an organization like the United Nations in the future may have to be given the instrumentality to to be able to do something about these instances of aggression. Bertrand Russell, a very sort of famous mathematician and philosopher, wrote an article in 1946 in which he said, I'm paraphrasing, I don't remember exactly the quote, but he said, wars will come to an end. It's interesting. Wars will come to an end when the aggressor knows with great certainty that he will be defeated. Just think about it. It seems such a simple statement to make, but there is a kind of a very, very powerful logic behind it, right? The reason why an aggressor today invades a country or sort of takes over territory of a neighbor or does other horrible injustices is because they feel they can do this with impunity, because we have a global order in which there is no organization whose responsibility it is to reverse these instances of injustice and violence, right? And that's what leads these tyrants and these authoritarians, to do the kinds of things that they have done in Yugoslavia, in Sudan, in Ukraine, and in other parts of the world over the last many decades. We have so many instances of acts of violence where the aggressor commits the act of aggression because he feels that there is no cost associated to doing this, right? But in a system envisaged in the Baha'i writings and advocated by Baha'u'llah, and which I think may be very much what the UN will have to do in the future, you actually would have an instrument to reverse the aggression, to punish the aggressor. And therefore, aggressors will have to be much more careful. They will have to calculate the odds that they will be able to defeat, this international peace force. And if the international peace force is powerful enough, as it should be, because it will be funded and it will be equipped by all the other members of the world, then what you could end up essentially is to having a peace force that will be a very powerful deterrent, and which therefore may never have to actually be used. You could have a very well-equipped army attached to the United Nations, which in fact is powerful enough so that aggressors will feel, no, I'm not going to do what I'd like to do because the possibility of defeat is very, very high. Why? Because this international peace force potentially has access to vast resources from all the other members of the United Nations, right? And so Russell said, in that instances, wars will come to an end. Wars come to an end because the aggressor will feel that he cannot take on essentially the rest of the world. And that's exactly what Baha'u'llah was talking about. That is exactly the concept of collective security which he laid out in the 19th century. Because I think he anticipated, that there was a need, in the context of greater integration and the coming down of barriers to trade, to interaction among nations of the world, the possibility of conflict, including global conflict, would rise. And therefore you needed to have this concept, as an operating principle that would deter aggressors from doing the horrible things that they have done, whether it is Hitler in World War II, or whether it is, the Russian army in 2023.
Thank you. The next question is, even if the UN Charter gets amended, it seems that the arm of the UN that can enforce these measures is almost non-existent. What are some of the measures that the UN members can make to correct this lack?
I think that we need to go back to some of the ideas that were already embedded in the Charter in the area of collective security and operationalize them. We need to give the United Nations the instruments necessary to be able to stop aggression and stop violence. And in order to do that, you may need to strengthen the Charter, or we may need to come at some point to the realization that the current system is not working, it's leading to more violence, it's leading to all kinds of unresolved problems, and that therefore the system needs to be refounded. That's what happened in World War II, by the way. You know, we had the League of Nations established between World War I and World War II. The League of Nations was ineffective. The United States did not join because they did not get the support of the Senate. And so it was a very ineffective organization, which eventually collapsed. It collapsed under the onslaught of the rise of Hitler in Germany and so on. But it was then replaced by the United Nations, a better organization, better design, but still with flaws. So the time may come when we have to essentially, you know, sort of rethink the UN system and refound it, recreate it, and sort of come up with an organization that will have the instruments to actually do what the UN Charter lays out as its principal objective, which is peace and security and prosperity.
Thank you. I think we'll end there. Thank you so much, Dr. Lopez-Claros, for this talk. We really enjoyed it.
All right. Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure to have this conversation with you. As you can imagine, it's a very complex subject, but the Baha'i writings, I think, that have provided a very, very coherent vision of what it is that will take, you know, to cooperate on a global scale to address many of these global challenges. Thank you.
Our speaker next week will be Mark Heinz, and his topic will be wildlife conservation through a spiritual lens. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, and I put the link to our mailing list and our YouTube channel in the chat. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next week. Bye.